I don't trust, support, or respect the senior leaders of the military anymore. I witnessed some of the most unethical, hypocritical, and really disappointing decision-making on part of senior leaders.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds, where truth needs no consensus. I am Stephanie Weidel, your host. Please share and subscribe to our podcast channels and find us on social media. We're on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Find out more about Feds for Freedom and what we stand for and work towards at fedsforfreedom.org. This episode is sponsored by Triple E Farms. Ever wish you could turn back the clock and get food like it used to be? Like it was about 200 years ago? There were barely any chemicals or drugs back then. Farmers worked with the land instead of against it. Animals were always outside. Food was pure, simple, and uncomplicated. This is exactly what Triple E Farms is about. It's why they started regenerative farming in the mountains of Romney, West Virginia. Triple E Farms has a large selection of raw dairy for you and your pets too. Pastured eggs, grass-fed and finished beef, pastured pork, corn and soy-free chicken, and more. They follow all the natural standards. No antibiotics, no hormones, no GMOs, just natural food. Triple E Farms ships to all 48 lower states. For more information and to start shopping, visit tripleefarming.com. Use the coupon code FEDSFREEDOM for 10% off your first order. Triple E Farms, pure, simple food, like it was 200 years ago.
Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Rebecca Tummers, a vaccine-injured member of the Army who has a lot to say about a concerning military retention trend. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Rebecca.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Why don't you tell us a little bit of your history, ending with why you entered the military?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally, I'm from Palmdale, California. And I come from what I think in modern times would be considered a very large family. So I am the fourth of 6 children. I'm kind of smack dab between 2 older brothers and 2 younger brothers. And kind of how I got into the Army is kind of happenstance, actually. Just before I started high school, we met with our guidance counselors as we were, starting to select our high school courses to include our electives. And so I sat down with my guidance counselor and she's, asking me what I'm interested in for my electives. And I kind of told her, I was like, listen, I can't sing. I can't paint. I'm not artistic. So please don't put me in choir or anything that requires me to do art because I might fail and it would impact my GPA. So we kind of sat down and we're like, well, what do you like to do? And she's like, it seems like you're really good at PT and you really like to run. I was like, yeah, I did cross country. She's like, what's your mile time? And I told her, and she's like, you might want to consider going into JROTC because what that is it's Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. And, you wear uniforms on occasion, but they do a lot of physical training. And I think you'd really like it. And so I was like, you know what? Sure. Sounds great. Go ahead. And I think by about midway through my freshman year, I think it was pretty apparent that my JROTC instructors thought I had potential, both maybe for service, but just in general, maybe to go to college. And I come from an area that I would say maybe a lot of kids don't get into college or struggle to get into college. So they were really interested in making sure that I had an opportunity to go to school. And so by my junior year, I think they realized I was dead set on joining the Army. So no matter what, one way or another, I was going to be joining the Army. And so they started talking to me about West Point. And I had never heard of West Point. But they started to help me through the application process. And about a year and a half later, I got notified that I was accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And I kind of sat there and I was like, well, it's really far away. I'm in California. This is in New York. I don't know anybody in the actual military. I don't know anybody who's went to that school. But I kind of thought about it and I was like, well, if I'm afraid of it, it must mean that it'll be good for me. I started to realize if I was nervous about it, it probably had the most opportunity for me to grow. And so I was like, I don't want to look back on my life and realize that I missed an opportunity because I was afraid. And so I decided to, sign my acceptance to West Point, and the rest is kind of history. That was about 10 years ago.
And so, what is your current job in rank?
So I'm a captain. If I were staying in, I would be promoted to the rank of major within a couple of months. But I am currently a targeter at JSOC, and I have been for the last 2 years.
And would you explain what a targeter is and JSOC is?
Okay, yeah. So JSOC is the Joint Special Operations Command. Basically, all that means is uh, that we have people from every service, so Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force. They're all represented at Joint Special Operations Command, which is at Fort Liberty. And as a targeter, my job is to identify individuals within organizations that are considered maybe like a threat. And my job is to find vulnerabilities that we can exploit to identify where they are, what they're doing, what their intent is, and then provide recommendations to a commander on what we should do about those individuals.
So, what was your response in 2021 when the COVID shot mandates came out?
So I think even prior to the COVID shot mandate coming out, there was pretty significant pressure. I mean, the writing was on the wall. We had been warned that the shot was going to become mandatory at some point, and that there were people that were pushing very hard for it to be mandated. But even prior to that, we were pressured pretty heavily. So we had senior leaders coming to our formations, briefing us. We had mandatory individual counselings for the unvaccinated. Unvaccinated soldiers were required to come in early and receive like counselings and speeches. They would also pull us aside at physical training formations. They had medical providers come talk to us, basically trying to reassure us that the shot was safe, that it was effective, and that it was FDA approved, and that none of us had anything to worry about. So it was pretty intense. And I think as it got closer to the mandate coming into effect, we started getting other pressures. Like, I basically got told that anybody who did not get the vaccine was forfeiting their chances to get a most qualified evaluation. So basically what that means is during a pinnacle point in your career, you're going to be denied the highest evaluation. Basically, you can't earn the A if you don't get the vaccine. And by that point, I was totally fine with not, getting the most qualified eval. I had already been accepted to my next job at Joint Special Operations Command. I was already selected to go there next. So my eval was not particularly important to me. So I just decided I wasn't going to get it at that point. By the time the mandate came around, they started threatening the commanders with basically, if you don't get the vaccine, the positive personnel actions of your soldiers will not be processed. So if an award or a school request comes through for a soldier in your formation, if that comes from an unvaccinated commander, it will not be processed. And so it was kind of at that point that I realized that my actions were going to be held against my subordinates. And I think that at that point is when those of us who kind of had resisted the shot up until that point decided that, it may be time to get it.
And this is when you were under Brad Miller, correct?
Yes, he was. So he was not yet my battalion commander. He became my battalion commander after the mandate.
Okay. And besides him, did you see anyone stand up?
No. I think there were some company grade officers. There were myself and a couple of my sister commanders who were the rank of captain, kind of mid-grade captains at the time, definitely expressed our concerns with how rapidly that the shot was developed. The FDA approval that we were being told about, like how rapidly that had occurred, the emergency use authorization. We were all, I think, a little bit concerned, but I had very junior soldiers that pushed back more heavily than anybody else I saw, to be honest. I had a platoon in particular that had a lot of people who refused to get the shot. Even after the mandate came into effect, they were pretty adamant about the fact they were not going to get it under any circumstances. And they received a lot of heat for that. Like that platoon in specific was very unpopular, we will say, with the leadership.
And what eventually happened to that platoon? Do you know?
So I think some of them, so I ended up changing out of command shortly before Lieutenant Colonel Miller was relieved or, was left the battalion. But I left to Fort Liberty, and I received a phone call about a month and a half after I left, where the next commander who took over after me was basically asking me for all of the counseling packets because we got forced to negatively counsel those soldiers who did not get the vaccine. So when I was at JRTC at Fort Polk, Louisiana, I kind of stood on a cot and gave them this spiel that was all written out for me, basically saying, you are receiving this negative counseling because you did not get the COVID shot. And it went on to say like 4 or 5 paragraphs worth of things. And I was told that I had to read that verbatim and that every soldier and myself had to sign. So a couple of months later, I got a call from the next commander asking me like, hey, where did those counseling packets go? I was like, they were all saved on a computer. I have no idea. And that's kind of the last I heard of it. But I do believe that some of the soldiers from that platoon ended up leaving the military as a result of not getting the vaccine.
Mm. Did you have a problem counseling the soldiers like that?
I did. I think, one, they knew kind of where I stood. They knew that I was not supportive of a mandate. They knew that I also probably would not have gotten the shot had I not been threatened with their careers. I don't know how many of them knew that. I tried not to advertise that too much because I didn't want them to feel like guilty or I didn't want them to like look at me differently. So I just tried to keep that pretty quiet. But I think that some of them had kind of realized that there was a reason that suddenly I went from not getting it to getting it. And it was very much after my own evaluation had been threatened. So I think they kind of knew something was going on. And they knew that I didn't agree with the mandate. And I told them that, like, listen, this is not coming from Rebecca to you. This is coming from Captain Tummers is being ordered to read this to you. And I think they knew I respected them. And to be honest, I loved them all very much. And I think they knew that if there was anything I could have done, that I would have.
Did you pursue any exemption process?
Funny. No, I did not. I think it was pretty clear from the very beginning that these exemptions were kind of bogus. I want to say basically bogus. It was like a kangaroo court, basically. They gave people the opportunity to submit exemptions, both religious and medical exemptions. Most of the religious exemptions were just flat denied pretty quickly within a couple of weeks. And even medical exemptions. Once I saw a pregnant female request an exemption for just the time of her pregnancy and breastfeeding. And basically her medical exemption did not go through and they treated her like complete trash for not getting the vaccine while she was pregnant. And then she continued to fight while she was breastfeeding. I realized that nothing in my medical history could even remotely, I cannot remotely even fathom getting a medical exemption if she couldn't. Because her being pregnant, her breastfeeding mattered 0.
Had you ever gotten an exemption before?
Yes. I had gotten an exemption for the smallpox vaccine. Because I have pretty severe eczema, they told me that it would not be particularly safe for me to get the smallpox vaccine.
Well, hey, there was a bit of informed consent right there. They told you what could happen. So, hey, that's the way it should be. All right. So how did your body respond to the shots?
So I ended up getting 2 vaccines. They were both the Pfizer vaccine. And the first one, I didn't particularly notice really anything. The second vaccine I got, I think it took a couple of months for me to really notice anything. I went to JRTC with Colonel Miller. We went down to Fort Polk. That's like a month-long training exercise, and you kind of expect weird stuff to happen down at Fort Polk. You don't get to shower for 20 days at a time. You're out sleeping in the woods. People get poison ivy. People you're not sleeping at all. You're getting rained on. So you kind of don't expect to be in the best of health down at JRTC, and people tend to get kind of sick after or during. So I didn't really notice anything particularly off at that time. It was about maybe a week after I got back from JRTC, I immediately PCSed to Fort Liberty and immediately started having very like odd allergic reactions. I thought it was kind of funny because I had just come from Fort Liberty. Back then it was called Fort Bragg. So I was kind of shocked that I was having all of these weird allergic reactions. You know, I'd lived there for 4 years before, I'd never had an issue. I look at Tennessee and I look at North Carolina, they have a lot of the same environmental allergens. And I'm like, I don't understand why all of a sudden, like, I'm becoming, responsive to these things. But I did, I had talked to a couple of people and I realized allergies can develop as you get older and your body can change. So I did my best to kind of, let that play out. Like maybe I just need to adjust.
An allergic reaction meaning hives?
I had hives all over my body. And I think the more obvious trend was that my eyes would almost completely swell shut. I would have bags on under my eyes that were fluid filled. And they would swell both my top and bottom eyelids. My lips would swell. And I couldn't narrow it down to really any singular substance, no foods. So then I was just very confused. I was taking every antihistamine under the sun, Benadryl, Claritin, Allegra, Zyrtec, nose spray, eye drops specifically for allergies, and nothing was even touching it. So I ended up going to the ER probably between 6 and 12 times over the next year. And each time it would be, a pretty significant dose of prednisone. And then the symptoms would subside for some time and then they would start again. And so I started to realize like, okay, there must be something else going on here if my body is continuing to do this despite, going through the appropriate measures to prevent allergic reactions.
And were you progressively getting worse?
Yes, it was progressively getting worse, both in the amount of times that I was, getting these reactions and the extremity of the reactions. In 2022, I actually got a booster a Pfizer booster, because I was ordered to as I was deploying to Baghdad, and they were saying that it was mandatory to have received not only the COVID shot, but a booster as well to deploy. When I went to Baghdad in kind of fall of 2022, my reactions were miserable. I was taking 3 to 4 Benadryl a day. I was putting hydrocortisone cream like all over my body. And to be honest, nothing was working. And that's when I started to really realize that something was off, because Baghdad doesn't have a ton of environmental allergens. If anybody's been there, it's pretty stark, right? So I was like, okay, there is something off here. Like there is nothing in Baghdad that should be causing these type of reactions, pollens and stuff like that. So when I got home, I was pretty adamant with my provider that I wanted blood tests to be done and I wanted to start seeing specialists because I couldn't figure out what was going on.
And so what did the doctor say?
So the doctor did agree that, I think at that point he kind of realized like, okay, something may be legitimately off. He ordered me blood tests. He sent me to an allergist. And then he also sent me a referral to a rheumatologist. But the appointment for the rheumatologist took 9 months to get. It took me legitimately 9 months to see a rheumatologist.
I've been hearing, yes, rheumatologists, endocrinologists, they're slammed right now.
Yes. So I even offered to drive up to like 2 or 3 hours away. And still the earliest appointment that I could get was 9 months out.
Mm-hmm. All right. So where does that put it? Did this just happen? Did you just see a rheumatologist?
So I think it was about 2 months ago when I called Lieutenant Colonel Brad Miller. That was right after I saw the rheumatologist. So I went in and they basically told me that I have benign idiopathic allergic responses. Basically, my body is responding to non-threatening stimuli. And the hard part about it is that it appears to be very random. One day something can cause an allergic reaction. The next day it doesn't. And it changes. So it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint the best treatment option, because even allergy shots, while they're treating some of the things that I react to most consistently, there are other things that sometimes I react to and sometimes I don't. And they're not exactly sure why my body is reacting to those kind of non-threatening stimuli.
Mm-hmm. So you started to get answers just very recently about what perhaps caused this. And so your rheumatologist said this is probably a vaccine injury. Is that correct?
Yes. So I didn't bring it up. Like, I had kind of my own suspicions. Once I was in Baghdad, I kind of started to think like maybe this could have to do with the COVID shot. I kind of did my own meticulous inventory of my medical history. Had I been exposed to anything different? Had my diet changed? Had my environment changed? I had done a pretty meticulous inventory myself, and I had some concerns that it could be connected. But she flat out told me during our appointment that there's really only two things that could probably initiate something like this. The first is that you were exposed to some sort of virus, which, based on your medical history, doesn't look like you were, or a shot. And she's like, and looking at your shot records, you have received all of these other shots multiple times throughout your life and never had a reaction. The only new introduction is the COVID shot. So anthrax, you've had it for years. Any of these, even Japanese encephalitis, all these weird shots that you get in the military, like, you've had them over the years and never had a reaction. There's only one new shot that it could likely be, and that's the COVID shot. And she told me pretty openly that she had been seeing a lot more cases that were very similar to mine.
And what does she call your cases? Like, what?
So
it's an autoimmune issue, basically.
Yes. So she told me it was basically, like she said, benign idiopathic allergic responses. She did encourage me to get tested for MCAS, or mast cell activation syndrome. She encouraged me to continue with allergy shots and then to request additional allergy testing. So also testing foods, not just environmental allergens. And she said, just continue to kind of progress through that treatment plan. And then she also said it would be worth maybe speaking to an immunologist.
And I can tell you what they're going to say. Oh, we don't know. This is different. We don't know what this is. The doctors, that's what they tend to say. But your rheumatologist was very different, because she actually mentioned the word vaccine injury. I mean, it's very rare that a medical professional will do that.
Yes, she did say in the beginning, she's like, there are really only two things, and that's you contracted a virus somewhere, which doesn't appear that you have, or it could be this also, like, kind of like, sorry to tell you. And she apologized. And it was kind of interesting to hear a medical provider. She's just like, you appear to be one of the people who did not respond positively. And I'm sorry for that.
Wow. So having a medical professional say this is probably vaccine induced, shot induced, does that help focus your mind on the path forward?
Absolutely. I think I was very frustrated. Like, how did this happen? Like, why all of a sudden am I spending 2 hours of my day icing my face, taking Epsom salt baths? Anytime I go outside, anytime I do yard work, I get hives everywhere. And it doesn't sound like such a big deal until your face is so swollen, you can't see, your eyes hurt, you're very fatigued because your immune system is just constantly fighting nothing. And it's creates a lot of fatigue. And I would say it's extremely uncomfortable. And when you spend, 2 hours of your day icing your face, and you're taking breaks throughout your workday, or you're coming home at night and you're waking up in the morning an hour early to ice your face to go out in public, it starts to get very tiresome. And I think I was so frustrated, like, how did this happen? How did my body all of a sudden just decide it didn't, hated everything, I was just so frustrated. And for her to kind of acknowledge that, like, it was a suspicion I had, but I would never have brought up, because I know how medical providers can get. They can get very defensive, not about specifically the COVID shot, but just vaccines in general, but particularly the COVID shot. So I would never have brought it up on my own. So to hear her kind of acknowledge that and apologize, I think it really gave credence to a lot of my assessments, and at least made me understand, like, okay, this happened. This wasn't just a change in my body. And now I can try to figure out what to do to kind of combat and reverse some of the damage.
What do you think will encourage more medical professionals to stand up and actually say the word? Are they truly just unaware that what they're seeing is probably a vaccine injury, or can they just not? Are they just not willing to speak?
I think it's kind of maybe a little bit of both. I think that people like me kind of hoped for the best. Like that was what kind of my mindset going into getting the shot. Um, I always felt kind of uncomfortable with it, even up until the point I got it. But in my head, I kind of, talked myself into, you've gotten tons of shots before, tons of vaccines, nothing's ever went wrong. You're going to totally be fine. Maybe 1 in a million people are going to have an issue. Statistically, you're not likely. And I think I really did like just hope for the best, right? And I think that that's what a lot of medical providers have also done. We all kind of hoped for the best. And then as they see increasing number of cases that point to potential vaccine injuries or negative reactions to the shots, I think particularly as they start to see trends, right? And that's why I thought it was important for me to share my story is because, I think as they identify like certain subsets of populations that have been more likely to have certain responses, they can, one, start to maybe exempt people, or maybe they realize that this shouldn't be on the market at all. Some of them maybe shouldn't be on the market at all. Maybe there are some exemptions that should have existed from the very beginning and didn't. And I think that those type of cases are really going to be over time what encourages medical providers to come forward. People need to be vocal. People need to share their stories. They need to be very open with, which is kind of a sensitive topic, to be very open with your medical dilemmas. But I think it is important to do that because that's really the only thing I think that will eventually compel providers who I do think have their patient's best interest in mind to come forward. And I know that some providers have, right? Like my provider did it behind closed doors, but there are medical providers who, for instance, fought to get the trial data published in a more timely manner when the federal government said, hey, you have 75 years to publish your trial data. There was a group of providers that fought back and said, no, that's unacceptable. We want this now. And they won in federal court. So there are providers doing it. A provider told me behind closed doors, and we can only hope that as time kind of progresses and cases are shared, that more providers come forward and start demanding answers.
Mm. All right. So you're getting out of the military, correct?
I am.
Yeah. Why?
I think there are a lot of reasons for me. But I would say if I had to boil it down to one real issue, it's I don't trust, support, or respect the senior leaders of the military anymore. I came in as a second lieutenant, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, went to the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st JSOC, and I truly loved the Army more than I can possibly describe. I was the Kool-Aid drinker, if there ever was one. Everything was Army to me. And I think as time progressed, over and over and over again, I witnessed some of the most unethical, hypocritical, and really disappointing decision making on part of senior leaders. And I mean, the COVID shot was part of that. The mandate was part of that. Nobody standing up for anybody, or at least making sure people didn't get kicked out. That was part of it. But there were tons of other instances of, watching fraud, waste, and abuse, watching people do some pretty self-serving things, watching people lie. And they were in positions, where their decisions meant life or death for people, and they lie. I've seen them lie about personnel readiness. I've seen them lie about equipment readiness. Anytime there's a CTC rotation, these, brigade commanders and division commanders are touting to Congress that we're 90% ready, that 90% of our personnel are deployable right now. And it's a lie. It's maybe hovering around 65, 70%. But they will say, and they'll drag all these people down there that are non-deployable. They'll drag them down to GRTC, get them the attendance. As soon as the attendance is taken by FORSCOM, they send all of those kids who never should have been down there back home. And they say we're 90% ready, and we're sitting at about 65% readiness at any given point. And that goes the same for our equipment. We regularly oversell how ready we are on an equipment perspective, and you just get tired of the lies. And people are lying to kind of get a good eval, pin on their next rank, and nobody's willing to stand up and say this is not true. All of these brigade commanders, all of these division commanders are lying. We're not 90% ready. We're 65% ready, but no commander is willing to say that because that means that they will not get promoted. And I
Have
think
you gone?
just couldn't.
Have you gone to your commanders and stuck it to them and asked, why are you not speaking the truth?
Oh, yeah. You get very unpopular very quickly. I'm very outspoken. I'm definitely the person that says what everybody else is thinking, but won't say. And you build kind of a reputation when you're that way. I definitely am somebody who went against the grain and fought pretty hard for what was right. I mean, arguably, there is no gray area in this. You're lying or you're not.
How did they respond?
Am I allowed to cuss on this podcast? Because I got called a bitch.
So they turned it around on you. They did not respond to the question.
Yeah.
And they did not do what was right. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. I definitely got told that in no kind words that, yeah, that I was.
And you saw this more. You saw this more than a couple times.
More than a couple. I went to 5 CTC rotations in my time. So I went to JRTC 5 times and watched every single time, line by line, where commanders would say, we're 90% ready. And I would watch them drag kids on crutches, kids on oxygen tanks, pregnant soldiers down to JRTC, one of which had a miscarriage on a bus. I would watch them drag these people down to JRTC and claim that they were deployable. They would sit them in what we call white cell for about a week. And then ForceCom would do their pull and they would send all those people home. And meanwhile, we're getting credit for all of those people being deployable.
So they're helping raise the numbers.
Yes.
So what does this mean for military readiness? I mean, if there was a conflict and the military is supposed to defend the people of the United States against foreign adversaries, if there were a conflict, what does this mean?
So it's funny that you say that because that's kind of exactly what I said. I said, there is going to come a point where Congress, our elected officials are going to be forced to make a decision. And in the event, I come from infantry brigade combat land, light infantry. And I said, we are going to be given an area of operations or an area of responsibility that reflects 90% readiness. And when we only have 65 to 70% at best, we are being given an area of operations to control or to take ownership of that we don't really have the ability to manage. And I would always bring up Cop Keating because that was an example of where, a unit was deployed and had fewer people than necessary to defend their position. And a lot of people ended up getting hurt and dying because they did not have the manpower necessary to hold that terrain. And I brought that up numerous times as an example. And I was like, it's all good until it's not. We can lie through our teeth and it's all good until it's not. At some point, this is going to come around. And we're going to see the impacts of people lying for decades.
Were there no other people as the same rank as you saying these same things?
I mean, they would definitely say it in WhatsApp, groups, and they would definitely say it, I think, behind closed doors. That's mainly where everyone says everything, right, is behind closed doors. But there were very few commanders that would definitely not above the company level that would acknowledge that this was the reality. You would get some company commanders, the young captains that are pretty fiery, like me and a couple of others, that were willing to kind of push back to our brigade and battalion commanders. But once it got above that, I didn't see it at all. It was all a numbers game. What battalion's going to get closest, the highest percentage, because they knew that would impact their eval. If they could just get close to 90 or they had the highest of the other battalion commanders, that might mean they get a brigade command. The brigade commanders were on the same wavelength.
It's just incredible. So we're talking about, what about recruitment? What is recruitment like?
I would say, it's pretty difficult. I think every branch of service, maybe except the Marine Corps, has failed to meet their recruiting goals for quite some time now. And I think it's particularly difficult for some of those technical occupational specialties that are already kind of hard to recruit, right? If you're recruiting anybody who's doing IT or anybody who's doing anything technical, you already have very stiff competition, right? Like, you know that the military is not going to be able to pay the most. So it was already kind of difficult to recruit certain groups of people. But I think that that's even more difficult now.
Mm. So I believe it's about 80%, I'm sorry, 80,000 people were let go due to the COVID shot mandates. And so you're saying also retention is going down, like people like yourself are leaving. At what rate do you think?
I would say it's pretty high. I don't have like, statistics based on, rank or occupational specialty. But once again, I would say a lot of those more technical occupational specialties are really difficult to retain. But I would say amongst the officer corps, it's pretty terrible. I have seen a lot of my classmates from West Point that I never would have fathomed getting out of the military. They're leaving. And some of us are leaving at 10 years, which I think most of us who were kind of at that point expected to do a full 20-year career. Um, and I see a lot of us leaving. And, we could have left at the 5-year mark. We could have left at the 8-year mark and had our GI Bill and had a lot of those benefits, but we really wanted to stay. And I see a lot of people in that position who are, at the 10-year mark, 12-year mark, who are just leaving. And it's not even worth staying for the retirement for them, because they're so disenchanted, which is really sad.
And what is the reasoning they're giving, at least among the friend group that you have?
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely think it's people have tons of reasons that they get out. And I definitely don't want to start speaking for everyone. But I will say that out of the people that I'm, closest to or that I've talked to, I think people generally are saying, we signed up to do something that we are not doing at all. And I think that, kind of like me, people had an expectation that people in the military were super honorable, super ethical, worked super hard. And I mean, admittedly, when I was, a second lieutenant, I saw that every day. I saw senior officers just crushing it. They worked harder than anybody I'd ever seen, and I admired them. I admired them greatly. But as I kind of continued my time in service, I stopped seeing examples of that.
And was it that your eyes were opened to more of what was going on, or did like the character change in that short amount of time?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I think, as you kind of progress through the ranks, you see behind the curtain a little bit. You get made privy to some things that you probably, weren't made privy to as a junior lieutenant or a junior officer. So I think it's a little bit of both. But I think that the Army writ large and the DoD writ large, from an institutional and kind of a systemic perspective, really reward selfish, what I call CYA behavior, right? I've got told by multiple officers in the military, when there's an investigation, there's 3 things you do: you lie, you deny, and you counter accuse, right? Lie, deny.
You were told this?
Deny. I mean, yeah, that's a rampant phrase throughout the Army, right? Is, hey, there's an investigation, lie, deny, and counter accuse, right? The military is not necessarily what I expected it to be. I expected it to be a family of people who took care of each other, who supported each other, who had each other's best interest in mind, and really had the organization's best interest in mind, right? Like, more than any individual, the organization and our mission would come first. And over the years, I have seen that the mission often comes last. The self-interest of very specific individuals come first. And I just couldn't get behind and couldn't stay in an organization that operates that way.
What would you say to someone who said, well, you're a traitor to this country by speaking of the military that way?
I'd laugh and tell them to join the military. I'd say, see for yourself. I encourage people to join the military and see what it's all about and see what's really going on. And I kind of have this conversation a lot where I say, the American public trusts the military far more than elected officials, far more than police, far more than firefighters, and far more than even emergency services personnel. Right? Every year you get a public opinion poll like who does the, American public trust? Whose word do they trust? And regularly, especially since, the global war on terror started post 9/11, you really see the military come to the forefront in the American public's mind. The thank you for your service culture is so prominent. And, I was very, very proud of that and very appreciative of that. And I think that that's something that's so unique and beautiful about America because I've traveled all over the world and it's something that you don't see. You don't see the public trusting, loving, respecting, and appreciating their military the way that Americans do. And I think the worst part over the last 10 years, watching as I realized that maybe of the American, like most of the military, maybe people shouldn't trust, right? Is realizing that maybe the American public has misplaced their trust. And more so than that, a lot of senior ranking military members have breached the trust of the American people. And that is the hardest thing to kind of come to terms with is that we've been given so much trust from a group of people that have really just inherently given, no questions asked, respect and admiration. And really, I don't think collectively we deserve as much as we've been given.
This makes me sad talking about this.
It makes me very sad too. I think I've probably spent the last year as I've kind of grappled with this decision to get out. I think I've probably spent a good amount of that crying my eyes out because I realized that it is not what I thought it would be.
Do you think this will turn around?
I think it's going to be pretty difficult, uh, it's just kind of the hard part. It's like how do you fix this? How do you rebuild trust, particularly within the ranks? I think the American public writ large still probably has a ton of respect for the military. Once again, very much appreciate that from our public. However, I do think that it's going to be very difficult to convince people like me or like other people whose trust has been, just completely obliterated over time. Not just one, two, three, four things or five things. It's been a decade of consistently seeing certain things that you just can't unsee. I think, like, if my kids wanted to join the military, I'd be like, absolutely not. If I had kids, I would not encourage them to join the military, which is sad because I lived, breathed, and ate everything Army for so long. Um, and I definitely was like I said, the Kool-Aid drinker. But I definitely would not probably encourage my kids to go into the military. And I don't know how you can really turn that around without there being kind of a complete overhaul of the system kind of as it exists now, from the evaluations process to the UCMJ and the processes and the UCMJ in general, some of the commander's discretion with administrative action. There's just also government, you can look at general officers who are invested in certain companies and who secures government contracts. You can look at, former general officers who are now sitting on the board of directors of certain companies, who are working very closely with the military and then leveraging those relationships from the military to secure government contracts for those companies. I think that so much of it is so perverse at this point that there would have to be just a complete system overhaul for people to really trust the institution as it exists right now.
Mm. So how do you think the military will get their numbers up in order to defend the country? This is going back to retention and recruitment.
So I feel like they're offering some pretty, awesome financial incentives, some bonuses for certain occupational specialties. I think pilots, there's some huge, bonus for pilots as they attempt to compete with airlines. So I think you do see some money being thrown at the problem. But at the end of the day, especially for like the officer corps, like you're never going to be able to compete. I mean, I got offered a salary before I was, 6, 8 months away from getting out, and I got offered 2.5 times my salary in the Army after 10 years, right? The military cannot compete. I got for, $170,000, right? Um, the military cannot compete with that. They will never be able to compete with that. The government will not. So you have to give something other than money, right? And I would have turned down any job, anytime, anywhere, regardless of how much someone was offering me, if the military was what I thought it was when I was a second lieutenant. Like, there is nothing that, no amount of money that could have come between me and the army, for sure. So you have to offer something other than money because that's just not going to do it. And that what that is an organization and a job that you can be proud of. And when people no longer are proud of the organization that they represent, I think that that's until that happens, like you're going to lose people.
Do military members have a way to defend themselves and their rights? I know you've spoken about this before, but would you go into that?
So I think generally no, right? Generally no. I think the answer is no. I think UCMJ and I think most lawyers or, anybody who has a legal background would agree that UCMJ is pretty problematic. But from a larger perspective, the administrative actions that commanders can wield to accomplish the same exact thing um, are are kind of what inhibits service members from having really any rights whatsoever. And I'll kind of explain it like this: like if a commander cannot pursue UCMJ because from an evidentiary perspective, they don't have the ability to meet the threshold for UCMJ action. They can pretty
And would
much
you
use
explain what UCMJ is?
the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So it's kind of basically the law of the land for military. And if a commander doesn't have like the breadth of evidentiary support that they need to pursue UCMJ against a service member for anything, um, they can often accomplish very similar things by administrative action. For example, I was a company commander. If somebody got accused of something and there was no real evidence to support that, be it infidelity or anything else, they got accused of driving under the influence or anything else. If I didn't have the evidence to actually support that and I couldn't kick them out of the military by chaptering them, as a commander I can just bar them to reenlistment. So I may not kick them out, but as soon as their contract is up, they are no longer able to enlist. So I basically accomplished kicking them out without actually having any evidence to support that the accusation was real. Um, and I felt very privileged to have that type of responsibility and that authority because it is a burden to have that discretion. But I think that some commanders definitely utilize that in a way that is completely inappropriate.
Well, what will you be up to now? So you're getting out very soon. What are you going to do?
Yeah, so very excited for that. It's been kind of a year of limbo while I kind of wait um, for that whole process to go through. But I will be attending Duke's Fuqua School of Business, and I will be pursuing an MBA there. There is some potential for me to also try to get a JD while there. Starting to study for the LSAT now to hopefully pursue a dual degree while there. But in terms of what profession, that's kind of, you know, I'm still kind of waiting for something to pop out at me that, I don't know what will replace the passion and the fervor and the excitement of the military, right? It's the only thing I've known. I kind of started as a 13-year-old kid in JROTC, went straight to West Point and then straight to the Army. So I think it's going to be very, very hard to replace the Army in my life. But I'm hoping that, with meeting tons of people from all over the world, Fuqua was 40% international students from various backgrounds. I'm hoping that something will kind of strike a fire and light that match for me to go pursue that.
Do you have any final thoughts before I ask my last question?
I think it's very hard in this time, in this day and age, to really know the truth. I've talked a lot about that with people I'm very close to. That how do you even know what's real and what's not anymore? I think with the social
Yep.
media and the AI and all of the that that's photoshopped, that's, created by AI, that's fake news, that's disinformation. I think it's so difficult. And I think Americans are in a very, very precarious and very difficult position at this point to kind of figure out what's true and what's not anymore. And I think that's a really like scary position for us to be in.
Yeah. If the average American citizen could do one thing to combat the corruption that we see very clearly, what would it be?
I would say scrutinize everything. It kind of goes back to that you don't know what's real and what's not anymore. Scrutinize everything. I think that the people we've trusted the most are often the people that deserve it the least. I think that we've kind of given the wrong people a platform. We've given, wrong people the ability to make decisions. And we kind of have to figure out what we're going to do about that. It's like I said, it's kind of a precarious position. It's very difficult to figure out, to kind of weed through the, noise and figure out the reality of a situation. But it's possible. It's there. But I would say scrutinize everything and everyone. I think that people have abused the trust that we've given them.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on with us today. It's honestly a little bit hard talking about this because it's sad because it destroys what we thought was the case, the whole idea. But thank you for speaking up and for speaking with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I didn't think it was possible to make better, I probably wouldn't be here, right? That's why I'm here. I think that it's possible to make all of these things better. We just have to figure out what the best way to do it is.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Visit our website where you can sign up for our latest newsletters and become a member of Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.